Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into the hidden world carved right into the buildings around us. The secret symbolic language of Freemason architecture that's been hiding in plain sight for centuries. We're talking compass and squares embedded in courthouse facades, mysterious geometric patterns that turn city halls into three-dimensional philosophy textbooks, and the fascinating story of how America's civic buildings became silent teachers of ancient wisdom. So if you're ready to start seeing your everyday surroundings with completely new eyes, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what hidden symbols you might have in your own town. I bet there are more than you think. Now settle in. Maybe grab something to sketch with, because you're going to want to document what you discover, and let's unlock the secret messages that master craftsmen left for us in stone. You didn't choose to notice them at first. The symbols were there, carved into cornerstones and keystones, etched into lintel stones and tucked beneath the eaves of buildings you passed every day. But once you see your first compass and square, really see it, not just glance past it like another decorative flourish, everything changes. The world becomes a coded message, and you realize you've been walking through a library written in stone your entire life without knowing how to read. It starts with the courthouse. You're 17, slouching through another tedious errand for your father's law practice, when sunlight catches something in the granite facade. There, carved with deliberate precision above the main entrance, sits a perfect compass and square. The compass points upward, the square frames the base, and between them, barely visible unless the light hits just right, the letter G. Your first instinct is dismissal, decorative nonsense. But something in the precise angles, the intentional placement high enough to be noticed by those who look up, suggests otherwise. You mention it to your father that evening over dinner. He pauses, fork halfway to his mouth, and gives you a look you've never seen before. Not disapproval, exactly, but something more careful, more measuring. He sets down his fork and asks what else you noticed about the building. You describe the other details you remember, the way the columns seem to follow some mathematical proportion, how the entire structure feels balanced in a way you can't quite explain. Your father nods slowly and tells you that some buildings are constructed by men who understand more than just how to stack stone upon stone. Some buildings, he says, are designed to teach lessons to those who know how to look. That night you lie awake thinking about hidden lessons and wondering what else you've been missing. The next morning you walk differently through town. Your eyes drift upward, scanning facades and doorways, looking for patterns. And once you start looking, really looking, the symbols emerge everywhere. The bank building sports a beautifully carved trowel worked into the stonework near the roof line. The old church, which you've attended every Sunday for 17 years, reveals a perfect ashlar block carved into its cornerstone, so weathered and familiar you've never truly seen it before. Even the public library, built just 5 years ago, displays a subtle but unmistakable level and plumb line worked into the decorative frieze above the main reading room windows. You begin to understand that these aren't accidents or mere decorative choices. They're signatures, calling cards, messages passed between craftsmen across centuries. The compass and square appear again and again, sometimes obvious, sometimes hidden in plain sight among other carved details. You start carrying a small notebook, sketching what you find, noting locations and variations. The symbols become an obsession, then a study, then something approaching reverence. Your father watches this transformation with what you now recognize as amusement. One evening, after you've spent an hour describing the elaborate Masonic symbolism you've discovered worked into the design of the new courthouse in the county seat, he asks if you'd like to understand what you're looking at. Really understand it. You nod eagerly, and he tells you about craft guilds and ancient traditions, about men who built cathedrals and temples, who passed down knowledge through symbols and stories, who created a language of stone that could communicate across centuries and continents. He explains that the compass represents the spiritual realm, the infinite, the divine spark that guides men's souls. The square represents the earthly realm, the material world, the moral foundation upon which a man must build his character. Together, they symbolize the balance every person must achieve between the spiritual and material aspects of existence. The letter G, when present, stands for geometry, the divine science that underlies all creation, or for God, the great architect of the universe, depending on who's doing the interpreting. But these are just the beginning, he tells you. The language is far richer, far more complex. The rough ashlar stone represents man in his natural, unrefined state. The perfect ashlar represents what man can become through education, moral development, and spiritual growth. The trowel symbolizes the spreading of brotherhood and kindness among men. The level teaches equality, reminding that all men, regardless of worldly rank, are equal in the sight of the divine. The plumb line represents integrity and moral uprightness, the quality that keeps a man's actions aligned with his principles. You absorb this information like stone absorbs water, slowly but thoroughly. And you begin to see how these symbols work together, how they create not just decorative patterns, but entire philosophical statements carved into the very bones of buildings. The men who included these symbols weren't showing off. They were teaching, preserving, communicating truths they believed were fundamental to human existence. Your exploration expands beyond your hometown. You begin taking weekend trips to nearby cities, armed with your notebook and a new appreciation for architectural details most people ignore. In the state capital, you discover a magnificent example of Masonic architecture in the old State House. The building itself follows classical proportions that speak to the mathematical harmony the builders sought to express. Carved into the pediment above the main entrance, a massive compass and square dominates the facade, impossible to miss yet somehow invisible to the streams of visitors who pass beneath it daily. But it's the details that truly captivate you. Above each of the side entrances, perfect ashlar blocks are carved with such precision they seem to glow in the afternoon light. The corners of the building feature keystones decorated with trowels and levels, each one slightly different but clearly part of a unified design philosophy. Even the bronze door handles are shaped like gavels, the working tools of lodge officers, polished smooth by thousands of hands that may or may not have understood their significance. Inside, the symbolism becomes even more elaborate. The main rotunda features a ceiling painted with the 7 liberal arts, represented by female figures, each holding symbols of their respective disciplines. Grammar holds a pen and scroll. Rhetoric displays a scroll and torch. Logic wields a serpent and flowers. Arithmetic counts on her fingers before a tablet of numbers. Geometry holds a compass and square. Astronomy studies a celestial sphere. Music plays a small organ. These aren't random decorative choices, but a deliberate representation of the educational curriculum that Freemasons have promoted for centuries, the foundation of knowledge they believe every thoughtful person should possess. The floor of the rotunda itself is laid out in alternating black and white tiles, creating a checkerboard pattern that stretches from wall to wall. To most visitors, it's simply an elegant design choice. But you now recognize it as the mosaic pavement of Masonic tradition, representing the duality of existence, the interplay between light and darkness, good and evil, spiritual and material, that characterizes human experience. Every step across that floor is a reminder of life's moral complexity. You spend hours in that building, sketching details, taking notes, marveling at how completely the Masonic worldview has been integrated into the structure. This isn't a building with Masonic symbols tacked on as an afterthought. This is a building conceived and executed as a 3-dimensional representation of Masonic philosophy, a teaching tool disguised as a government office. Your research reveals that this isn't unusual. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, as America built its civic infrastructure, Masonic architects and builders infused their work with symbolic meaning. Courthouses, libraries, schools, banks, even fire stations carry these hidden messages. The men who designed and built America's public buildings were often members of Masonic lodges, and they saw no conflict between their civic duties and their fraternal obligations. If anything, they saw their public work as an extension of their Masonic commitment to human improvement and social progress. You begin to recognize different regional styles and time periods in the symbolism. Earlier buildings tend toward more subtle integration, with symbols worked into existing architectural elements. A trowel might be carved into the center of a rosette. A compass and square might appear as part of a larger decorative scheme. Later buildings, particularly those from the 1920s, often display their Masonic heritage more boldly. Entire facades might be dominated by enormous compass and square designs. Cornerstones might feature elaborate Masonic inscriptions. Doorways might be flanked by carved columns representing the pillars of Solomon's temple. The variation reflects not just changing architectural fashions, but changing social attitudes toward Freemasonry. In the early days of the Republic, Masonic membership was a mark of civic respectability. George Washington was a Mason, so were Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, and dozens of other founding fathers. Displaying Masonic symbols on public buildings was a way of connecting new American institutions to ancient traditions of wisdom and brotherhood. It was considered entirely appropriate, even desirable. But as the 19th century progressed, attitudes became more complex. Anti-Masonic political parties emerged, fueled by suspicions about secret societies and their influence on government. Some communities began to question whether public buildings should display the symbols of private organizations. The response varied by region and era. Some builders became more subtle in their approach. Others doubled down, creating even more elaborate symbolic displays as if to assert their right to express their beliefs in stone. Your notebook fills with sketches and observations. You develop a system for cataloging what you find, noting not just the symbols themselves but their context, their apparent age, their relationship to other architectural elements. You begin to see patterns that go beyond simple decoration. The placement of symbols often follows specific rules. Compass and square designs typically appear in positions of prominence, over main entrances or at the highest points of facades. Lesser symbols, trowels and levels and plumb lines, appear in secondary locations. The progression suggests a hierarchy of meaning, with the most fundamental symbols given places of honor. You also notice that many buildings incorporate what you learn are the three great lights of Masonry: the square, compass, and volume of sacred law. Sometimes these appear together in elaborate carved scenes. More often, they're distributed throughout a building's design, requiring careful observation to identify. A courthouse might display a prominent compass and square over the main entrance, incorporate square and level motifs in the stonework, and feature an open book representing the volume of sacred law, carved into a pediment or keystone. The more you study these buildings, the more you appreciate the skill required to create them. These weren't simple decorative additions that any stonecutter could manage. The precision required to carve a perfect compass and square, with all angles mathematically correct and all proportions harmonious, demanded both artistic ability and deep understanding of geometric principles. The men who created these symbols were master craftsmen in the truest sense, able to transform abstract philosophical concepts into tangible, beautiful forms. You begin to seek out the stories behind specific buildings, digging through historical records and local archives. You discover that many of America's most prominent architects were Masons. Frank Lloyd Wright, despite his reputation as an artistic individualist, was initiated into Freemasonry and occasionally incorporated subtle Masonic elements into his designs. The architect who designed the Supreme Court building was a Mason, as were the men responsible for many of the most iconic structures in Washington, D.C. The stories you uncover reveal the care and intentionality behind the symbolism. When Masonic builders undertook a public project, they often met in special sessions to discuss how their philosophical principles could be expressed in the design. They debated the placement of symbols, the mathematical proportions to employ, even the orientation of the building itself. East-west alignments were preferred when possible, reflecting the Masonic emphasis on the daily journey of the sun from darkness to light. Sometimes the symbolism tells specific stories. You discover a small town courthouse where the builders incorporated elements representing the 3 degrees of Masonic initiation. The ground floor features rough ashlar stones and simple geometric patterns, representing the entered apprentice degree and the beginning of a man's Masonic journey. The second floor displays more refined stonework and intermediate symbols, reflecting the fellowcraft degree and the development of skill and knowledge. The third floor, housing the main courtroom, features perfect ashlar work and the most elaborate symbolic decorations, representing the Master Mason degree and the attainment of wisdom and leadership. The building becomes a vertical representation of spiritual progression. with each floor marking a stage in the journey from ignorance to enlightenment that masonry seeks to facilitate. Judges and lawyers working in that courthouse may or may not understand the symbolism surrounding them, but they're conducting their business within a structure designed to remind them of moral and spiritual principles. You begin to appreciate how thoroughly these buildings integrate form and meaning. The Masonic emphasis on geometry isn't merely aesthetic. It reflects a belief that mathematical harmony underlies all creation and that human works should mirror divine order. The careful proportions of Masonic buildings aren't accidents, but expressions of this philosophical commitment. When you measure the facades of these structures, you often find they conform to classical ratios like the golden section or incorporate other mathematical relationships that create a sense of balance and rightness. The symbolism extends to building materials and construction techniques. Many Masonic buildings feature conspicuous displays of fine stonework, not just because stone is durable and impressive, but because masonry traces its origins to the medieval stonemasons' guilds. Working in stone connects contemporary builders to their craft ancestors, maintaining an unbroken chain of tradition stretching back centuries. You learn to recognize the signature elements that mark buildings as products of Masonic builders. Cornerstones are often positioned and decorated according to Masonic ritual, sometimes with dates and inscriptions that refer to Masonic chronology rather than ordinary calendar years. Windows might be arranged in patterns that reflect Masonic numerical symbolism, with 3 windows representing the 3 degrees, 5 representing the 5 points of fellowship, 7 representing the 7 liberal arts. Color choices, when they survive, often follow Masonic traditions. Blue appears frequently, reflecting Masonry's designation of blue lodges as the fundamental organizational units of the fraternity. White represents purity and perfection, while red symbolizes the Royal Arch degrees and the continuation of Masonic education beyond the basic 3 degrees. Even landscaping might incorporate symbolic elements. Acacia trees, which hold special significance in Masonic ritual as symbols of immortality, often appear on the grounds of Masonic buildings. Gardens might be laid out in geometric patterns that echo the lodge room floor. Walkways might be constructed from alternating light and dark materials, extending the checkerboard pavement concept to the outdoor spaces. Your understanding deepens as you begin to see how individual symbols work together to create complex narratives. A single building might tell the entire story of human development as Masonry understands it. Rough stones at the foundation level represent humanity in its natural state. As the eye moves upward, the stonework becomes increasingly refined, symbolizing the progressive development of human potential through education and moral instruction. At the building's peak, perfect ashlar blocks and elaborate carved symbols represent the fully realized human being, one who has achieved harmony between spiritual aspiration and earthly responsibility. The tools of operative masonry, transformed into symbols of speculative masonry, appear throughout these narratives. The 24-inch gauge, representing the proper division of time between work, service, and rest, might be carved into a clock tower or time-themed decoration. The common gavel, used by operative masons to break away rough portions of stone, symbolizes the effort required to chip away personal flaws and bad habits. More complex symbols appear in buildings constructed by builders with advanced Masonic knowledge. The beehive, representing industry and cooperation, often appears in commercial buildings constructed by Masonic architects. The anchor, symbolizing hope and steadfastness, might be incorporated into buildings near bodies of water. The ark, representing preservation of knowledge and tradition through difficult times, sometimes appears in libraries and schools. You begin to notice how these symbols interact with the building's intended function. Courthouses emphasize symbols of justice and moral uprightness: the square, the level, the plumb line. Schools feature symbols of learning and growth: the compass opening toward ever greater knowledge, books representing accumulated wisdom, tools representing the practical application of learning. Banks and commercial buildings might emphasize symbols of trustworthiness and fair dealing: the square, the trowel-spreading brotherhood, the handshake of fellowship. The sophistication of some symbolic programs amazes you. You discover a Masonic temple built in the 1920s, where every architectural element carries meaning. The number of steps leading to the main entrance corresponds to the number of officers in a Masonic lodge. The dimensions of the main hall reflect the proportions of Solomon's temple as described in Masonic ritual. Even the electrical fixtures are designed to represent stars, creating an indoor representation of the celestial lodge that Masonic tradition says encompasses all of creation. The building becomes a three-dimensional textbook of Masonic philosophy, with every room and corridor designed to teach specific lessons. A candidate progressing through the degrees of Masonry would encounter different symbolic elements as he advanced, with the building itself serving as part of his education. The architecture doesn't just house Masonic activities, it participates in them. You start to understand how these buildings function as links in a vast network of communication. A Mason traveling from one city to another could read the symbolic language of local buildings and understand something about the philosophical commitments of the community that built them. The symbols created a shared vocabulary that transcended local dialects and cultural differences, allowing brothers to recognize each other's work across vast distances and long periods of time. This network aspect becomes more apparent as you study buildings from different regions. You notice that certain symbolic motifs appear with remarkable consistency across the country, suggesting that builders were working from common source materials or following standardized practices. The compass and square appears in virtually identical form, whether carved into a courthouse in Maine or a city hall in California. The consistency suggests not just shared symbolism, but shared understanding of proper proportions and execution. Regional variations, when they occur, often reflect local materials or architectural traditions while maintaining the essential symbolic content. A wooden building in the Pacific Northwest might incorporate the same Masonic symbols as a limestone structure in the Midwest, but the execution would be adapted to the different medium. The symbols remain readable across these variations, testament to the clarity and consistency of the symbolic system. You begin to appreciate the role these buildings played in American civic life during their golden age. They weren't just structures, they were statements about the kind of society their builders hoped to create. The prominent display of symbols emphasizing moral development, education, and brotherhood represented a public commitment to these values. Communities that built Masonic, influenced civic buildings were declaring their belief in the possibility of human improvement and social progress. The educational aspect of the symbolism becomes increasingly important to you as you study it. These buildings were designed to teach, not just to those who understood the symbolic language, but to anyone willing to observe and think. A person might not recognize the specific meaning of a compass and square, but the mathematical precision and harmonious proportions of such symbols could still convey a sense of order and purposefulness. The buildings served as silent teachers, encouraging viewers to think about the relationship between human work and divine design. You realize that many of these structures were built during periods of rapid social change, when traditional sources of moral and educational guidance were being challenged by industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. The builders may have seen their symbolic programs as contributions to social stability, ways of preserving and communicating time-tested values in a rapidly changing world. The craftsmanship required to execute these symbolic programs represents a level of skill that's increasingly rare in contemporary construction. The stonemasons who carved perfect compass and square designs had to understand not just the symbolic meaning, but the geometric principles underlying the forms. They needed artistic ability to create beautiful objects and technical skill to execute them in durable materials. The integration of symbolic and practical concerns required a type of builder who was part craftsman, part philosopher, part teacher. You begin to seek out contemporary craftsmen who still understand these traditions. You find a few elderly stonemasons who learned their trade in the old style, working alongside masters who maintained the ancient connections between operative craft and speculative philosophy. They tell you about the pride previous generations took in their symbolic work, how builders would spend extra time ensuring that Masonic symbols were executed with special care and precision. These conversations reveal another dimension of the tradition, the personal spiritual discipline it required. Creating symbols meant to convey philosophical truths demanded that craftsmen understand and internalize those truths themselves. The process of carving a perfect ashlar block was simultaneously a technical challenge and a spiritual exercise, requiring patience, precision, and dedication to an ideal of perfection that could be approached but never fully achieved. You learn that the symbolic work often involved entire communities of craftsmen, not just individual artists. The stone carvers worked with architects to determine proper placement and proportion. Metalworkers created bronze and iron elements that complemented the stone symbols. Even the workers who quarried and transported the stone understood that they were participating in something larger than ordinary construction. This collaborative aspect reflects one of the central Masonic teachings that these buildings embody: the idea that meaningful accomplishment requires cooperation among people with different skills and perspectives. The buildings themselves demonstrate this principle, showing how individual craftsmen contributed their specialized abilities to create unified works of art and architecture. As your research progresses, you begin to document buildings where the symbolic content has been damaged or obscured. Weather and pollution have worn away carved details. Renovations have covered original decorative elements with modern materials. Sometimes entire symbolic programs have been painted over or removed during building modifications carried out by people who didn't understand their significance. These discoveries give urgency to your work. You realize that you're documenting a disappearing aspect of American cultural heritage. The knowledge needed to read and understand these symbolic programs is held by an increasingly small number of people. Unless someone makes the effort to record and interpret what survives, future generations may find themselves surrounded by beautiful but incomprehensible decorations. You start photographing and measuring the symbolic elements you discover, creating detailed records that could guide future restoration efforts. You interview elderly masons who remember when the symbolic language was more widely understood, recording their explanations of specific symbols and their memories of buildings from their youth that have since been demolished or altered. The urgency of this preservation work becomes personal when you learn that a courthouse in a nearby county is scheduled for renovation that will cover many of its original Masonic decorations with modern materials. You arrange to visit the building before the work begins, spending a long afternoon documenting the elaborate symbolic program that few people will ever see again once the renovation is complete. The courthouse represents one of the finest examples of integrated Masonic symbolism you've encountered. Built in 1895 by a consortium of Masonic contractors and architects, every element of the structure carries meaning. The front facade features a magnificent compass and square carved from local limestone, with the letter G rendered in darker stone that makes it visible from blocks away. Below this central symbol, carved panels represent the working tools of the various degrees of masonry, executed with such skill that they seem to emerge from the stone rather than being imposed upon it. The symbolism continues inside the building, where the main staircase features newel posts carved with the columns that in Masonic tradition supported the porch of Solomon's temple. The courtroom itself incorporates architectural elements that reference the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum of the ancient temple. Even the judge's bench is positioned to replicate the arrangement of officers in a Masonic lodge room. Standing in that courtroom, surrounded by symbols that have presided over decades of human drama, you understand something profound about the builder's intentions. They weren't just creating a functional space for conducting legal business. They were creating a sacred space, one designed to remind everyone who entered it of the moral and spiritual principles that should guide human judgment. The knowledge that these details will soon disappear behind modern materials fills you with a sense of loss, but also purpose. You spend hours sketching and measuring, trying to capture not just the appearance of the symbols, but something of their spirit. You interview the elderly custodian, who remembers when local masons would occasionally bring visitors to explain the building's decorative program. Those informal tours stopped years ago, as the generation that understood the symbols passed away. Your documentation work brings you into contact with preservation organizations and historical societies. You discover that you're not alone in recognizing the importance of this symbolic heritage. Scholars and craftsmen around the country are working to record and interpret Masonic architectural elements before they disappear entirely. Some are creating databases of symbolic motifs. Others are training contemporary craftsmen in the traditional techniques required to maintain and restore symbolic stonework. These connections lead to opportunities to study buildings and collections you couldn't have accessed on your own. You're invited to examine the archives of Masonic Grand Lodges, where you find original architectural drawings that show how symbolic elements were intended to be integrated into building designs. You discover correspondence between 19th century architects and Masonic clients, revealing the careful thought that went into planning symbolic programs. The archives also contain photographs of buildings that no longer exist, showing symbolic programs that have been completely lost. Some of these vanished structures were apparently among the finest examples of Masonic architecture ever created in America. Their destruction represents not just the loss of individual buildings, but the breaking of links in the chain of symbolic communication that connected communities across space and time. You begin to write about your discoveries, creating articles for historical journals and lodge publications. The response surprises you with its intensity. Elderly Masons write to share their own memories of symbolic buildings. Architectural historians contact you with information about structures you haven't yet documented. Even people with no connection to Masonry express fascination with the idea of hidden meanings in familiar buildings. The writing process clarifies your own understanding of what makes this architectural tradition significant. It's not just that the symbols are beautiful, though many of them are. It's not just that they represent an interesting historical curiosity, though they certainly do that. What makes them important is what they reveal about the aspirations and values of the people who created them. The builders who incorporated Masonic symbols into America's civic architecture believed in something that seems almost quaint today: the possibility that physical structures could contribute to human moral and spiritual development. They thought that a courthouse built according to symbolic principles might encourage judges and lawyers to conduct themselves more ethically. They believed that a school decorated with symbols of learning and wisdom might inspire students to pursue knowledge more seriously. Whether these hopes were realized is impossible to know, but the attempt itself speaks to a view of architecture as more than mere shelter or decoration. These builders saw their craft as a form of teaching, their buildings as textbooks in stone that could communicate important truths to anyone willing to observe and reflect. This educational aspect of the tradition becomes increasingly relevant as you study contemporary architecture and find it almost entirely stripped of symbolic content. Modern buildings prioritize function and economy, values that aren't necessarily wrong, but that leave little room for the kind of meaning, making that characterized earlier eras. The loss represents more than just a change in architectural fashion. It reflects a fundamental shift in how society understands the relationship between physical environment and human development. Your research expands to include Masonic buildings in other countries, revealing how the symbolic traditions adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining their essential character. British Masonic buildings often incorporate elements from classical architecture more extensively than their American counterparts, reflecting different educational and cultural backgrounds. French Masonic architecture tends toward more elaborate decorative programs, while German examples often emphasize the mathematical and geometric aspects of the symbolic system. These international comparisons reveal the remarkable consistency of the basic symbolic vocabulary while showing how it could be adapted to local conditions and preferences. A compass and square carved in Scotland looks essentially identical to one created in South Carolina, but the surrounding architectural context might be completely different. The symbols serve as a universal language embedded within diverse local dialects of architectural expression. You discover that some of the most sophisticated examples of Masonic architecture were created in unexpected places. Small towns that happened to have active lodges with building committees that included skilled architects sometimes produced more elaborate symbolic programs than major cities where Masonic builders were competing with other architectural influences. The variation reminds you that the tradition was never centrally controlled or standardized, It emerged from the individual choices of countless builders who shared common symbolic vocabularies, but expressed them in personally meaningful ways. The study of these buildings teaches you to see architecture as a form of literature, with individual structures serving as text that can be read and interpreted. The reading requires specialized knowledge, just as understanding poetry or philosophy requires education and practice. But once you develop the ability to decode the symbolic language, familiar buildings reveal layers of meaning that had been invisible before. This hermeneutical aspect of architectural symbolism connects to broader traditions of symbolic interpretation that have been important in human culture for millennia. Religious art, heraldic systems, and decorative programs in various cultural contexts all operate on similar principles, using visual elements to convey complex ideas and values. The Masonic tradition represents one particularly well-developed example of this universal human tendency to embed meaning in material objects. You begin to understand your own role in this tradition, not just as a documenter or interpreter, but as a participant in the ongoing process of symbolic communication. By learning to read the language of Masonic architecture, you become part of the community of understanding that the original builders hoped to create. Your notebooks and photographs serve as links in the chain of transmission that connects contemporary observers to the craftsmen and architects who created these structures decades or centuries ago. The responsibility of this role becomes more apparent as you encounter buildings where you may be among the last people to understand the symbolic content before it disappears through neglect or renovation. Your documentation becomes a form of preservation, maintaining knowledge that might otherwise be lost entirely. But it's also a form of translation, making symbolic meanings accessible to contemporary audiences who lack the cultural background to decode them independently. This translation work reveals how much the symbolic language depends on shared cultural knowledge that can no longer be assumed. A contemporary viewer looking at a carved compass and square might see only a decorative geometric pattern, missing entirely the philosophical and spiritual meanings that would have been immediately apparent to earlier generations. The symbols remain physically present, but their communicative power depends on interpretive communities that maintain the knowledge necessary to understand them. Your writing and documentation work contributes to maintaining and rebuilding these interpretive communities. By explaining the meanings behind Masonic architectural symbols, you help ensure that the buildings continue to communicate with future generations. The work requires not just historical research, but a kind of cultural archaeology, reconstructing the intellectual and spiritual contexts that gave the symbols their original significance. The process teaches you about the fragility of symbolic systems and the constant effort required to maintain them. Unlike natural languages, which are sustained by daily use, symbolic languages like those embedded in Masonic architecture require deliberate preservation efforts. Without people willing to study, interpret, and teach the symbolic content, the buildings become more archaeological artifacts than living communication. Your documentation work expands to include not just individual buildings, but entire symbolic landscapes. You begin to map the distribution of Masonic architecture in different regions, looking for patterns that might reveal how the symbolic tradition spread and developed over time. You discover that railroad lines and migration patterns often correlate with concentrations of symbolic buildings, suggesting how the tradition moved with the people who understood and valued it. Some regions develop distinctive local variations in their symbolic programs, reflecting the influence of particular architects or the preferences of local lodge communities. Others remained closely tied to standard symbolic vocabularies, perhaps because their builders had less confidence in their ability to innovate within the tradition. The variations provide insights into how symbolic systems evolve and adapt while maintaining their core communicative functions. You also begin to study buildings where symbolic programs were later removed or altered, trying to understand the social and cultural forces that led communities to abandon or reject their symbolic heritage. Sometimes the changes reflected simple ignorance, with later builders not understanding what they were covering or destroying. Other times, the modifications seem to have been deliberate, possibly reflecting changing attitudes towards secret societies or symbolic expression in general. These cases of symbolic loss provide sobering reminders of how quickly cultural knowledge can disappear. Buildings that took years to plan and construct, with symbolic programs that represented decades of accumulated understanding, can be stripped of their meaning in a single renovation project carried out by people who don't recognize what they're destroying. The urgency of preservation becomes more apparent as you document buildings threatened by demolition or insensitive renovation. Each loss represents not just the disappearance of individual symbols, but the breaking of connections within the larger symbolic network. When a significant Masonic building is destroyed, the symbolic conversation it was carrying on with other structures in the community comes to an end. Your work begins to attract attention from people interested in saving threatened buildings. Preservation organizations consult you about the significance of symbolic elements in structures they're trying to protect. Your documentation sometimes provides the cultural and historical arguments needed to support preservation efforts, demonstrating that buildings have values beyond their purely architectural or economic significance. These preservation battles reveal how little most people understand about the symbolic dimensions of their built environment. City planners and developers often focus exclusively on practical considerations, missing entirely the cultural meanings embedded in architectural details. The disconnect reflects a broader cultural shift away from symbolic thinking and toward more literal, functional approaches to understanding human environments. Working with preservationists teaches you about the challenges of maintaining symbolic architecture in contemporary contexts. Even when buildings are saved, their symbolic content may be compromised by changes in use or context. A courthouse designed according to Masonic principles might be converted to commercial use, preserving the physical structure but eliminating the functional relationship between symbolic program and intended purpose that gave the original design its meaning. These adaptive reuse projects raise complex questions about the relationship between form and meaning in symbolic architecture. Can a building maintain its communicative power when its function changes completely? Do symbols retain their significance when separated from the cultural context that originally supported them? Your research suggests that the answers depend partly on whether new users and viewers have access to interpretive frameworks that help them understand what they're seeing. The questions become more urgent as you document buildings that survive physically but have lost their interpretive communities entirely. You visit small towns where the last masons who understood the local symbolic architecture died years ago, leaving behind beautiful but incomprehensible decorations. The symbols remain perfectly legible to someone with the proper knowledge, but that knowledge no longer exists within the community that lives with the buildings daily. These situations represent a particular form of cultural loss, where the physical containers of meaning survive, but the meaning itself disappears. The symbols become like texts written in dead languages, potentially recoverable through scholarly effort, but no longer part of living cultural conversation. Your documentation work becomes a form of linguistic archaeology, attempting to recover and preserve knowledge that communities have lost. The metaphor of dead languages proves particularly apt as you study how symbolic architectural traditions decline and disappear. Like natural languages, symbolic systems require active use and transmission between generations to survive. When the chain of transmission breaks, the symbols may persist physically but lose their communicative power. Recovery becomes possible but requires the kind of deliberate scholarly effort that most communities can't or won't sustain. Your research reveals that the decline of Masonic architectural symbolism reflects broader changes in how American society understands the relationship between public space and cultural meaning. The builders who created these symbolic programs assumed that public buildings should express community values and aspirations, not just fulfill practical functions. Contemporary building practices generally reject this assumption, treating symbolic content as unnecessary decoration rather than essential communication. The shift reflects changing ideas about the proper relationship between private belief and public expression. The men who incorporated Masonic symbols into courthouses and city halls saw no conflict between their fraternal commitments and their civic responsibilities. They believed that the values Masonry promoted, moral development, education, brotherhood, were appropriate foundations for public institutions. Contemporary sensibilities are more suspicious of any connection between private organizations and public buildings, even when the organizations promote widely shared values. These changing attitudes help explain why new public buildings rarely incorporate meaningful symbolic programs and why existing symbolic elements are often removed during renovation projects. The symbols come to be seen as inappropriate expressions of particular rather than universal values, even when the values themselves, integrity, education, service to community, remain widely endorsed. Your documentation work becomes a way of preserving not just individual symbols, but the entire cultural framework that made symbolic public architecture possible. By recording and interpreting these building programs, you help maintain knowledge of a time when Americans believed that architecture could and should contribute to moral and spiritual development. When builders saw their craft as a form of teaching, when communities invested resources in creating structures that expressed their highest aspirations rather than just their immediate needs, the preservation effort goes beyond mere historical documentation to become a form of cultural criticism, raising questions about what contemporary communities gain and lose when they abandon symbolic approaches to architecture. The Masonic buildings you study represent experiments in using physical structures to promote human development and social harmony. Whether those experiments succeeded is debatable, but their abandonment represents the foreclosure of possibilities that might still have value for contemporary communities. Your research increasingly focuses on understanding not just what the symbols meant, but how they were intended to work. How builders believed that architectural symbolism could influence human behavior and social development. The investigation leads into areas of environmental psychology and symbolic anthropology, fields that study how physical environments affect human consciousness and behavior. The findings suggest that the builders' hopes for their symbolic programs weren't entirely naive. Research in environmental psychology demonstrates that physical environments do indeed influence human behavior, mood, and cognition in measurable ways. Spaces designed according to mathematical harmonies create subtle, but real effects on the people who use them. Symbolic decorations, even when not consciously understood, can influence how individuals think about their roles and responsibilities within particular contexts. The courthouse you documented before its renovation provides a case study in how symbolic architecture was intended to function. The building's symbolic program wasn't just decorative. It created an environment designed to remind everyone who entered of the moral principles that should guide legal proceedings. Judges conducting trials beneath carved symbols of justice and integrity might unconsciously internalize those values more deeply than they would in symbolically neutral spaces. Lawyers arguing cases surrounded by representations of moral uprightness might feel subtle pressure to conduct themselves more ethically. Whether these influences actually occurred is impossible to prove definitively, but the builder's belief in architectural influence reflects sophisticated understanding of how environments shape human experience. They recognized that people are constantly receiving messages from their physical surroundings and sought to ensure that those messages promoted positive values rather than neutral or negative ones. Your study of symbolic architecture leads you to examine contemporary building practices through this lens, considering what messages modern structures communicate and how they might be affecting the people who use them. The comparison isn't entirely flattering to contemporary architecture, where Masonic builders sought to create environments that elevated human consciousness and promoted moral development. Modern construction often prioritizes efficiency and cost-effectiveness above all other considerations. The result is public buildings that communicate nothing beyond their basic functional purposes. Contemporary courthouses look like office buildings. Schools resemble warehouses. City halls could be mistaken for corporate headquarters. The symbolic neutrality that characterizes modern public architecture may reflect admirable intentions to avoid favoring particular cultural or religious viewpoints, but it also forecloses the possibility that architecture might contribute positively to human development. Your documentation work reveals what American communities gave up when they abandoned symbolic approaches to public architecture. The Masonic buildings you study represent a time when communities believed that their most important structures should embody and express their highest values. When builders saw their work as contributing to human moral and spiritual development, when architectural beauty was understood as inseparable from architectural meaning, the loss extends beyond aesthetics to encompass entire ways of thinking about the relationship between individual development and social environment. The men who built symbolic courthouses and schools believed that human beings are deeply influenced by their surroundings, and that society has a responsibility to ensure that those surroundings promote positive development. Contemporary building practices generally reject both assumptions, treating environments as neutral containers for human activity rather than active influences on human consciousness. Your research suggests that this rejection represents a significant cultural loss, eliminating possibilities for using architecture as a tool for human and social development. The symbolic buildings you document demonstrate that it's possible to create public structures that are simultaneously beautiful, functional, and meaningful. Their existence proves that communities can invest in architecture that serves purposes beyond mere shelter and practical utility. The preservation challenge becomes more complex as you understand these broader implications. Saving individual symbolic buildings is important, but maintaining the cultural knowledge and values that made such buildings possible may be even more crucial. Without understanding of why symbolic architecture matters, preserved buildings become museum pieces, rather than living examples of alternative approaches to community building. Your documentation work evolves to include not just recording what exists but explaining why it matters. You begin writing for broader audiences, trying to help contemporary readers understand what their communities gained from symbolic architecture and what they've lost by abandoning it. The writing requires translating not just symbolic meanings but entire worldviews, helping readers understand how different communities have thought about the relationships between individual development, social progress, and physical environment. The translation work reveals how much contemporary culture has lost in terms of symbolic literacy. Most people today lack the conceptual frameworks necessary to understand how architecture might contribute to human development beyond providing shelter and practical space. The idea that buildings could serve as teachers, that decorative programs might promote moral development, that mathematical harmonies could influence human consciousness, strikes many readers as quaint at best, superstitious at worst. Overcoming this skepticism requires demonstrating the continuing relevance of symbolic approaches to architecture. You begin studying contemporary examples of meaningful architectural symbolism, looking for cases where modern builders have successfully integrated symbolic content with functional requirements. The examples are rare but significant, suggesting that the tradition isn't entirely dead, but has been marginalized by dominant architectural and cultural trends. Some contemporary religious buildings incorporate sophisticated symbolic programs that rival their historical predecessors in complexity and beauty. A few civic buildings, designed by architects with historical knowledge, include subtle references to traditional symbolic vocabularies. Even some commercial structures attempt to communicate corporate values through architectural symbolism, though usually with less sophistication than their Masonic predecessors. These contemporary examples demonstrate that symbolic architecture remains possible within modern construction practices and cultural contexts. They also reveal what's required to create meaningful, symbolic programs. Architects who understand traditional symbolic vocabularies, clients who value symbolic communication, and communities willing to invest resources in buildings that serve purposes beyond immediate practical needs. The requirements help explain why symbolic architecture has become so rare in contemporary America. Architectural education generally ignores symbolic traditions, focusing instead on formal innovation and theoretical concerns that have little connection to traditional meaning-making practices. Clients for public buildings typically prioritize function and economy over symbolic content. Communities often lack the cultural cohesion necessary to agree on values worth expressing architecturally. Your research reveals the specific historical moments when these conditions began to change, when American communities began to abandon symbolic approaches to public architecture. The shift wasn't sudden but occurred gradually over several decades. reflecting broader cultural changes that affected how Americans thought about tradition, community, and the proper relationship between public and private values. The decline accelerated during the middle decades of the 20th century, when modernist architectural theories gained dominance and explicitly rejected historical symbolism as inappropriate for contemporary building. Modernist architects promoted approaches to design that emphasized function, materials, and abstract formal relationships while dismissing symbolic content as irrelevant decoration. The theoretical framework provided intellectual justification for abandoning traditions that communities might have maintained for purely practical or sentimental reasons. The modernist critique of symbolic architecture wasn't entirely wrong. Some historical symbolic programs had become formulaic and clichéd, applied as superficial decoration rather than integrated meaningfully with architectural design. The worst examples of symbolic architecture were indeed mere decoration, added to buildings without careful consideration of how symbolic and functional requirements might be harmonized. But the modernist response, rejecting symbolic content entirely rather than working to improve its integration with contemporary building practices, eliminated possibilities for creating architecture that might serve broader human and social purposes. The result was a generation of public buildings that prioritized formal innovation and functional efficiency while communicating nothing beyond their immediate practical purposes. Your documentation work helps you understand both the achievements and limitations of the modernist approach. Modernist public buildings often succeed brilliantly as functional spaces and formal compositions. They fail as vehicles for community expression and human development, providing no means for communities to embody their values architecturally or for individuals to connect their daily activities to larger purposes and meanings. The failure becomes particularly apparent when you compare contemporary public buildings to their symbolic predecessors. A modern courthouse may be more efficient and comfortable than its 19th century equivalent, but it provides no inspiration for the people who work within it to conduct themselves according to high standards of justice and integrity. A contemporary school may offer superior educational facilities, but it communicates nothing about the value of learning or the importance of moral development alongside intellectual growth. The comparison isn't entirely fair, since contemporary buildings operate within cultural contexts that are far more diverse and complex than those that produced symbolic architecture. The builders of Masonic courthouses could assume shared values and common symbolic vocabularies that no longer exist in most American communities. Contemporary architects face the challenge of creating public buildings for populations that may disagree fundamentally about basic moral and spiritual questions. But the challenge of cultural diversity doesn't necessarily require abandoning symbolic approaches to architecture entirely. Your research reveals historical examples of symbolic buildings that managed to communicate broadly shared values without endorsing particular religious or cultural viewpoints. The key was focusing on universal human concerns, moral development, education, community service, justice that transcend specific cultural and religious boundaries. Some contemporary architects have begun exploring ways to revive symbolic approaches to public architecture that can function within diverse cultural contexts. These experiments often focus on environmental symbolism, using natural forms and materials to communicate values related to sustainability and stewardship. Others emphasize abstract geometric symbolism that can convey ideas about harmony, balance, and proportion without reference to specific cultural traditions. The emerging approaches suggest possibilities for developing new symbolic vocabularies that could serve functions similar to those provided by historical traditions while addressing contemporary cultural and practical requirements. The development requires architects willing to study and understand how symbolic communication works, clients interested in creating buildings that serve purposes beyond immediate practical needs, and communities capable of identifying values worth expressing architecturally. Your documentation work contributes to this developing conversation by preserving knowledge of how symbolic architecture functioned in the past and demonstrating what communities gained from investing in buildings that attempted to promote human and social development. The historical examples provide both inspiration and practical guidance for contemporary builders interested in creating architecture that embodies meaning as well as function. The preservation effort goes beyond saving individual buildings to maintaining cultural knowledge that might be essential for creating meaningful architecture in the future. By documenting and interpreting symbolic building programs, you help ensure that contemporary and future architects have access to traditional knowledge about how buildings can communicate values and influence human development. The work also contributes to broader conversations about the relationship between tradition and innovation in architecture and cultural development generally. The symbolic buildings you study demonstrate that innovation doesn't require abandoning all connections to historical knowledge and practice. The most successful examples of symbolic architecture combine traditional symbolic vocabularies with contemporary building techniques and design sensibilities, creating structures that were both historically informed and genuinely contemporary. This approach to innovation, building on traditional foundations while adapting to contemporary requirements, offers an alternative to both Slavish historical imitation and rootless modernist innovation. It suggests possibilities for creating architecture that honors the best aspects of historical building traditions while addressing contemporary needs and sensibilities. Your research reveals specific techniques that historical builders used to achieve this balance between tradition and innovation. They studied traditional symbolic vocabularies carefully, understanding not just the surface appearances of symbols, but their underlying meanings and functions. They adapted traditional forms to contemporary materials and construction techniques, maintaining symbolic content while embracing practical innovations. They integrated symbolic elements with overall architectural compositions rather than applying them as superficial decorations. The techniques remain relevant for contemporary builders interested in creating meaningful architecture. They provide practical guidance for integrating symbolic content with modern building practices and design sensibilities. They also demonstrate that successful symbolic architecture requires sophisticated understanding of both traditional symbolic vocabularies and contemporary architectural possibilities. Your documentation work helps preserve this practical knowledge by recording not just what symbolic buildings looked like, but how they were conceived and executed. The architectural drawings, correspondence, and construction records you discover in archives reveal the thought processes that guided symbolic building projects, showing how builders translated abstract philosophical concepts into concrete architectural forms. The records demonstrate the collaborative nature of successful symbolic architecture, showing how architects worked with clients, craftsmen, and community leaders to develop building programs that served both practical and symbolic purposes. The collaboration required participants who understood and valued symbolic communication, who were willing to invest time and resources in creating buildings that would serve purposes beyond immediate practical needs. The collaborative approach offers lessons for contemporary building projects that attempt to incorporate meaningful symbolic content. It suggests that successful symbolic architecture requires broad community support and understanding, not just individual architectural vision. It demonstrates the importance of involving skilled craftsmen who understand how to execute symbolic elements with appropriate care and precision. Your study of historical building processes reveals how much contemporary construction practices have changed in ways that make symbolic architecture more difficult to achieve. Modern building projects typically prioritize speed and economy above all other considerations, leaving little room for the careful planning and execution that symbolic programs require. Contemporary construction methods often rely on prefabricated components that can't easily accommodate custom symbolic elements. The changes reflect broader economic and cultural shifts that have affected how American society approaches building and community development. The men who created symbolic public architecture operated within economic systems that allowed for patient, careful work and cultural contexts that valued symbolic communication. Contemporary builders face different economic pressures and work within communities that may not share common values or symbolic vocabularies. But the historical examples demonstrate that meaningful symbolic architecture is possible even within economic and practical constraints. Many of the buildings you document were built with limited budgets by communities that weren't particularly wealthy. The key was prioritizing symbolic content and being willing to invest the additional effort required to integrate meaningful decorative programs with functional architectural requirements. The examples suggest that the main barriers to contemporary symbolic architecture may be cultural rather than practical. Communities that valued symbolic communication found ways to create meaningful building programs even with limited resources. Contemporary communities that prioritize symbolic content over other concerns could presumably achieve similar results, though they would need to develop the cultural knowledge and commitment that symbolic building requires. Your documentation work contributes to building this cultural foundation by demonstrating what communities accomplished when they invested in symbolic architecture and showing how such buildings continue to enrich the communities that preserve and maintain them. The work helps contemporary readers understand what their communities might gain from reviving symbolic approaches to public building. The educational aspect of your work becomes increasingly important as you recognize how completely American culture has lost touch with symbolic architectural traditions. Most people today lack not just specific knowledge about Masonic symbolism, but general understanding of how architectural symbolism functions as a form of communication. Recovering the tradition requires rebuilding basic symbolic literacy, along with specific knowledge about particular symbolic vocabularies. The rebuilding process involves helping people understand that buildings can communicate ideas and values, as well as provide practical shelter and space. It requires demonstrating how architectural details that might seem purely decorative actually carry complex meanings that were intended to influence how people think about their activities and responsibilities. It involves showing how communities can use architecture to express and reinforce their most important values and aspirations. Your writing and documentation work contributes to this educational process by making symbolic architectural traditions accessible to contemporary audiences who lack the cultural background to understand them independently. The work requires not just historical research, but cultural translation, helping modern readers understand worldviews and assumptions that are quite different from their own. The translation work reveals how much contemporary American culture has changed since the era when symbolic public architecture was common and widely understood. The builders who created these structures operated within intellectual frameworks that connected individual moral development to community welfare, that saw physical environment as actively influencing human consciousness, that believed architecture could and should contribute to human spiritual development. Contemporary American culture generally rejects or ignores these connections, treating individual development as separate from community welfare, viewing physical environment as neutral background for human activity, and seeing architecture as purely practical or aesthetic rather than moral or spiritual concern. The differences help explain why symbolic architectural traditions declined and why contemporary efforts to revive them face significant cultural obstacles. But the differences also suggest why recovering symbolic architectural traditions might be valuable for contemporary communities. The builders of symbolic public architecture addressed concerns that remain relevant today: how communities can promote positive human development, how physical environments can support rather than undermine human flourishing, how public institutions can embody and communicate important values rather than simply providing services. Their approaches to these concerns weren't necessarily correct or complete, but they represent serious attempts to use architecture as a tool for human and community development. Contemporary communities struggling with social fragmentation, loss of shared values, and disconnection between individual and community welfare might benefit from studying and adapting their methods. Your documentation work preserves knowledge that could be essential for such adaptation efforts. By recording not just what symbolic buildings looked like, but how they were intended to function and what they accomplished, you help maintain practical knowledge about alternative approaches to architecture and community building. The knowledge might prove crucial if contemporary communities decide to experiment with reviving symbolic approaches to public building. The preservation effort takes on greater urgency as you document the continuing destruction and alteration of symbolic buildings. Each loss represents not just the disappearance of individual structures, but the elimination of examples that could inspire and guide future building efforts. The destruction breaks the chain of visual and practical knowledge that connects contemporary communities to alternative architectural traditions. Your work becomes a race against time and indifference, attempting to document symbolic building programs before they disappear entirely. The effort requires not just recording individual symbols, but understanding how they functioned within complete architectural compositions and community contexts. The complexity of the preservation challenge reflects the sophistication of the traditions you're trying to save. But the work also reveals the resilience of symbolic architectural traditions and their continuing capacity to inspire and guide contemporary building efforts. Despite decades of neglect and destruction, enough survives to provide practical knowledge for communities interested in reviving meaningful approaches to public architecture. The surviving buildings demonstrate that symbolic architecture is possible and show what communities might accomplish if they choose to invest in buildings that serve purposes beyond immediate practical needs. Your documentation and interpretation work contributes to making that choice possible by preserving and communicating knowledge that contemporary communities need to understand what symbolic architecture accomplished and how it might be adapted to contemporary condition. The work serves as a bridge between past and future possibilities, maintaining traditions that communities might choose to recover and develop in new directions. The bridging function becomes particularly important as you encounter younger people who are fascinated by the symbolic buildings you document but lack cultural frameworks for understanding how such buildings might be relevant to contemporary life. Their interest suggests that hunger for meaningful architecture persists even within cultural contexts that generally ignore or reject symbolic approaches to building. The persistence of interest provides hope that symbolic architectural traditions aren't dead but dormant, waiting for cultural conditions that will support their revival and development. Your documentation work helps create those conditions by preserving practical knowledge and demonstrating continuing relevance of symbolic approaches to architecture and community building. The work transforms you from observer to participant in ongoing traditions of symbolic communication and cultural preservation. By learning to read the language of stone that surrounds you, you become part of the interpretive community that keeps that language alive. Your notebooks and photographs serve as contemporary additions to the symbolic conversation that began when the first builders decided to embed meaning in their structures. And in quiet moments, standing before buildings where craftsmen carved their deepest beliefs into stone, you understand that you're participating in something larger than historical documentation. You're helping maintain threads of cultural continuity that connect contemporary communities to ancient traditions of wisdom, beauty, and human aspiration. The symbols surrounding you aren't just decorations or historical curiosities, but living communications from people who believed that human beings deserve to inhabit environments that elevate their consciousness and inspire their highest possibilities. The stone speaks if you know how to listen, and now, finally, you do.